So, another pen picture of James from a Russian icon, what you might call an artist's impression. You can get a rough idea of that there. Lovely. Name, Jacob of Nazareth, aka James, brother of Jesus. Nationality, Galilean Jew. Dates, died circa 62. Appearance, not known, but may have had misshapen knees. Before he was famous, probably a carpenter or builder. Brother of Jesus along with Jude, Simon and Joseph. Famous for being the first leader of the church in Judea. Why does he matter? Because he represents the earliest Jewish form of Christianity. Could you have a drink with him down the pub? Maybe, but you would have to have been drunk. Sorry, you would have had to have drunk from different vessels. Not have to have been drunk. You'd have to have drunk from different vessels because of Jewish purity laws. That's a hard thing to say when you're drunk. Anyway, he ate heavy. In Judea, the followers of Jesus weren't known as the Christiani, but as the Nazarenes, although the term occurs only once in Acts. It must be an early term, since it originates from Aramaic, not from Greek or Latin. This means simply someone from Nazareth. So the founder of the sect came from Nazareth, and his brother, also from Nazareth, was the man in charge. Although we know him as James, that is the much later westernized version of his name. His name was Jacob. The Gospel accounts list several brothers of Jesus: Jacob, Joseph, Judas, and Simon. He also had at least one sister, but the girls are never named. Over the years, there have been arguments as to the precise relationship of these brothers. The Catholic Church, to support the doctrine of Mary's perpetual virginity, argues that they were cousins, while the Eastern Orthodox Church teaches that they were stepbrothers, children of Joseph from a previous marriage. However, the Greek word for cousin, anepsios, is never used of James and the others, either by the Gospel writers or by early Christian writers. So there. These brothers were not supporters of Jesus while he was alive, but according to the early church tradition, James was converted after an encounter with the risen Jesus. In a fragment from a now lost Gospel, known as the Gospel of the Hebrews, there is an account of this meeting. Jesus appeared to James, who had sworn that he would not eat bread from that hour in which he had drunk the Lord's cup, until he should see him risen from among them that sleep. And they eat bread together. With his fasting, the story reflects James's reputation in the early church for piety and asceticism. Hegesippus, one of the earliest historians of the early church, paints a portrait of James as a righteous Orthodox Jew whose life was such that he was known as James the Righteous, and who prayed so much that his knees became hard like a camel's. This reputation wasn't just among Christians. James is one of the few characters from early Christianity who is mentioned outside of the New Testament or Christian writings. He appears in the histories of Josephus. But his leadership role was not at the end of the day due to his piety or his Jewish orthodoxy. It was down to one thing: family. He was the Lord's brother, part of the dynasty, and this family connection continued for some time in Judea and Galilee. Jesus' brother Jude was also a well-known figure in the early church. And when James died, the leadership of the church passed to Simeon, son of Joseph's brother Clopas, and the cousin, therefore, of Jesus. Eusebius, who gives us this anecdote, wrote that he, Simeon, was a cousin, at any rate so it is said, of the Saviour. For indeed, Hegesippus relates that Clopas was Joseph's brother. This is probably the same Clopas who saw the risen Jesus on the road to Emmaus. Indeed, the 3rd century scholar Origen identified the other unnamed disciple in that episode as Clopas' son, Simeon. Simeon was executed in the reign of Trajan, sometime after AD 100, by which time the Christian community had left Jerusalem. There was also evidence that at the end of the 1st century, 2 of the grandsons of Jude, Zochar and Jacob, were still farming the family smallholding in Nazareth, but were also leaders of the Palestinian Jewish Christian community. And, taking the family connection even further, around AD 200, Julianus Africanus reported a tradition that the relatives of Jesus operated as missionaries, starting from Nazareth and Kochaba, a village near Nazareth, and taking the gospel throughout the land. The next section. I believe the Lord is saying, "Maketh mine a pepperoni." The church in Antioch started to grow. So the HQ in Jerusalem sent Barnabas out to manage things, and he in turn recruited Paul to come to help. Then, around AD 47, Paul made a return visit to Jerusalem, accompanying Barnabas and taking a gift, some money to help the home church during a famine. Paul by now was a man with a plan. Convinced of his special role to take the gospel to the Gentile world, he had a meeting with the acknowledged leaders, James and Cephas and John, where he told them what he was intending to do. In a kind of, here's the one I prepared earlier moment, he took with him a Gentile convert from Antioch called Titus, who was later to be one of Paul's most trusted lieutenants. No minutes are available for this meeting, and one imagines that the various parties may have had different impressions of what was agreed. Paul was the kind of man who, if you gave him an inch, would take a light year. He and Barnabas returned to Antioch, then embarked on a journey that was to last for most of the next 2 decades of his life. Say what you like about the Romans, and you can say what you like because they're all dead, they were very good at infrastructure. I mean, yes, they were brutal, violent tyrants, but they made lovely roads. When Roman soldiers conquered a region, the first thing they did was to build bridges and roads and aqueducts so that trade could flourish. They were like stormtroopers with shovels. The result was that travel was easier in the time of the mighty Roman Empire, TM, than at any time up until the 19th century. This enabled Paul and people like him to travel great distances to spread the word. Over the course of the next 2 decades, Paul travelled to many of the major cities of the empire. He endured great hardship, but he took the gospel to many areas it had not reached before. He was not always successful. In Corinth and Ephesus, he was instrumental in establishing churches. But in Athens, the philosophers there were pretty much baffled by what he had to say. Elsewhere, Paul's teaching and speaking resulted in riots and violence. This was a man who could cause an argument in a phone box. Paul, of course, was not the only Christian missionary trudging the roads of the Roman Empire. There were many itinerant preachers and teachers, and some of them had a flexible approach to their expenses. A first-century discipleship training manual called the Didache gives instructions for congregations to help them to work out if a visiting teacher was offering genuine spiritual food, or was just after free bed and board. The Didache states that a real apostle will stay in one place for only a maximum of 2 days, and if he asks for money, he is a false prophet. It also gives a fine example of one of their tricks. It says that any prophet who orders a meal in the spirit shall not partake of it. If he does, he is a false prophet. Quite how this worked, we don't know. Maybe the false apostle spoke in tongues and then interpreted his own message as, "Thus saith the Lord, order a 4 seasons pizza with extra garlic bread." That's fine, said the Didache, provided he doesn't take a slice for himself. Above all, in an instruction that one thinks later generations would have been wise to heed, the true teacher was to be shown by his actions. Not everyone who speaks in the Spirit is a prophet, but only if he exhibits the Lord's ways. If any prophet teaches the truth, yet does not practice what he preaches, he is a false prophet.